Suzanne Delage by Wolfe. As I was reading last night, reading a book, I should explain, which was otherwise merely commonplace, one of those somewhat political, somewhat philosophical, somewhat historical books, which can now be bought by the pound each month. I was struck by a certain remark of the author's. It seemed to me at the time an interesting, if almost self-evident, idea, and afterward, when I turned the page, and many other pages, and was half through a new chapter bearing very little relation to what had gone before, this idea found its way back into my consciousness, and there acted as a sort of filter between my mind and the book, until I put it down, and, still thinking, went up to bed. The idea which had so forcibly struck me was simply this, that every man has had in the course of his life some extraordinary experience, some dislocation of all we expect from nature and probability, of such magnitude that he might in his own person serve as a living proof of Hamlet's hawk-eyed precept, but that he has, nearly always, been so conditioned to consider himself the most mundane of creatures, that, finding no relation to the remainder of his life in this extraordinary experience, he has forgotten it. It seemed to me, considering the immense extent of the universe of the senses, and the minute size of that area of it we think of as every day, that this must certainly be correct. Yet if it were true of every man, it ought also be true of me, and try as I might, I could remember no such extraordinary circumstance. When I switched off the light, I lay recalling, very pleasantly on the whole, my life. It has been a pleasant life, though I fear a dull and perhaps a lonely one. I live now not 5 miles from the hospital in which I was born, and have lived nowhere else. Here I grew up, learned a profession, practiced, and much sooner than most men, retired. I have twice been married, but both marriages were brief, and both ended in friendly separations. The truth is that my wives, both of them, bored me, and I am very much afraid I bored them as well. As I lay in bed then, thinking of times when my grandfather had taken me fishing, and of skating parties with friends, and about our high school team, on which I was a substitute quarterback, but one so much inferior to the first-string occupant of that position, that I almost never got into a game, unless we were several touchdowns ahead, which was not often. It at least occurred to me that there was, in fact, been one thread of the strange, I might almost say the incredible, though not the supernatural, in my own history. It is simply this, living all my life, as I have, in a town of less than 100,000 population, I have been dimly aware of the existence of a certain woman without ever meeting her or gaining any sure idea of her appearance. But even this is not, perhaps, as extraordinary as it may sound. I have never made an effort to meet this woman, and I doubt that she has ever attempted to meet me, if indeed she is aware that I exist. On the other hand, we are neither of us invalids, nor are we blind. This woman, her name is Susanna, though I fear most of us here have always pronounced it Susan Delage, lives, or at least so I have always vaguely supposed, on the eastern edge of our little city. I live on the western. I doubt that we, as children, attended the same elementary school, but I know that we were, for 4 years, at the same high school. I was able to ascertain this as a matter of certainty through my yearbooks, which my mother, with that more or less formalized sentimentality characteristic of her, saved for me in the attic of this tall, silent frame house, itself saved for me as well. Actually, of the 4 volumes which must originally have existed, only 2 remain, those of my sophomore and senior years. There are a number of pages missing from the class picture section of the earlier book, and I seem to recall that these were torn out and cut up to contain the individual photographs many decades later. My own face is among those missing, as well as Suzanne Delage's, But in another section, one devoted to social activities, a girls' club, it was called, I think, the Pie Club, is shown, and one of the names given in the caption is Susanna's. Unfortunately, the girls in the picture are so loosely grouped around a stove and a work table that it is not possible to be certain in any case which name should be attached to which young lady. Besides, a number of them have their backs to the camera. The senior book should have told me more. At least so I thought when I, at last, came across it, at the end of an hour or so of rummaging. It is whole and undamaged, and I, thanks largely to football, have no less than 4 pictures in various parts of it. Suzanne Delage has none. On one of the closing pages, a woebegone roll of names reminds me of something I had forgotten for many years, that there was an epidemic of some kind, I think Spanish influenza, just at the time the pictures for the annual were to be taken. Susanna is listed as one of those unable to be photographed. I should explain that ours is one of those overgrown schools found in the vicinity of small towns, a school repeatedly extended because the growth of the town itself had been slow, though always fast, so it seemed in retrospect, than anyone anticipated, and the taxpayers had not wanted to authorize a new one. It was large enough, in short, that only a few leading students, the star athletes, the class officers, the few really promiscuous girls, and the dazzlingly beautiful ones whom we, in those naive times, called queens, were known to anyone. The rest of us, if we moved socially at all, went by classes and cliques. A student might know the others in his English and algebra rooms. The cliques, at least the ones I remember, were the football players and their girls, the children of the rich, the boys and girls whose families attended a certain fundamentalist church on the outskirts of town, and certain racial minorities, the chess and debating society types, and the toughs. It sounds, I suppose, as though they were a group for everyone, and at the time, since I was fairly well entrenched among the athletes, I believed I thought myself, if I thought about the matter at all, that there was. I now realize that all these little coteries embraced no more than a third of the school, but whether Suzanne Delage had entry to one or more of them I do not know. I should, however, have made her acquaintance long before I attended high school, says Mrs. Delage, Susanna's mother, was one of my own mother's close friends. They had met, I think, at about the time I was 8, through a shared passion, much more widespread in our area, I think, than the country as a whole, and more ardently pursued in the past than it is now, for collecting antique fabrics. In other words, for embroidered tablecloths, for quilts, crocheting of all kinds, Afghan, callow work, hand-hooked rugs, and the like. If my mother or her friends could discover a sampler, or a bedspread, or comfortable, made in the early part of the 19th century, it was their enduring hope, I think, never well satisfied, to find a piece from what they called American Revolution times, by which they meant the 18th, even such dates as 1790 or 1799, a piece well made and decorated, the more the better, in the unschooled traditional ways of the old farm families. Then their joy and their pride knew no bounds. If, in addition, the work was that of some more notable woman, or to be more precise, of some woman relation of some notable man, the sister, say, of a lieutenant governor, and could be authenticated, the home of the finder became a sort of shrine to which visitors were brought, and to which solitary pilgrims from other towns came, ringing our bell, for we possessed, as a result of mother's efforts, a vast appliqued quilt, which had been the Civil War time employment of the wife of a major in a Fencible Zouave regiment, usually at 10:30 in the morning, and offering, in introduction, a complicated relation of friendships and cousincies linking themselves in her own family, bearing homages like cookies on a plate, and eager to hear, for the better direction of their own future strategies. The circumstantial description of the inquiries and overheard clues, the offers made and rejected and made again, which had led to the acquisition of that precious object which would, as the termination of the interview, at last be brought forth in a glory of moth crystals, and spread sparklingly clean, for of those collected pieces were never used, over the living-room sofa to be admired. Mrs. Delage, who became my mother's friend, possessed pieces of her own as valuable as the Major's wife's quilt, which was, as my mother never tired of pointing out, entirely hand-sewn, in a collection, too, of lesser treasures, ranking, as my mother herself admitted, with her own hoard. Together they scoured the countryside for more, and made trips so exhausting that I was, as a boy, always surprised to see how very willing, in a few weeks, my mother was to go again, to view the riches of neighboring counties, and even once or twice by rail of neighboring states. It would therefore have been entirely logical for Mrs. Delage to have been our frequent guest, at least for tea, and for her to have brought, occasionally, her little daughter Susanna, who I would no doubt have soon come to both love and hate. This would doubtlessly have occurred but for a circumstance of a kind particular, I think, to towns exactly the size of ours, and incomprehensible not only to residents of cities, but to truly rural people as well. There lived, directly across the brick-paved street from us, a bitter old woman, a widow, who for some reason never explained to me, detested Mrs. Delage. It was lawful for my mother to be friendly with Susanna's, but if, women in small towns somehow know these things, she had gone so far as to invite Mrs. Delage to our house, this widow at once would have become her enemy for life. The invitation was never given, and I believe my mother's friend died while I was at college. Thus, while I was still small, I was hardly aware of Suzanne Delage, though my mother often mentioned her. In high school, as I indicated, though I was in much closer proximity to the girl myself, this was hardly altered. I heard of her vaguely, in connection perhaps with some friend of a friend. I must surely have seen her in the corridors hundreds of times, if one can be said to see in a crowd people one does not know. I must sometimes have shared classrooms with her, and certainly were together at assembly and in the vast study hall. She should have attended many of the same dances I did. It is even possible that I danced with her, but I do not really believe that, and if indeed it happened, the years have so effectively sponged the event from my mind that no slightest trace remains. And in fact, I think I would never have recalled the name of Suzanne Delage at all, as I lay in bed last night, listening to the creaking of this empty house in the autumn wind, and searching the recesses of my mind for some extraordinary incident which to attest the author's thesis, if it had not been for something that took place a few days ago. I had been shopping, and happened to meet, on the sidewalk in front of one of the larger stores, a woman of my own age, whom I have known all my life, and who is now the wife of a friend. We stood chatting for a moment, she, after the usual half-teasing reproaches about my supposed gay bachelor life, gossiping about her husband and children. As she turned to leave, a girl of 15 or so came out of the store and, smiling but intent upon her own concerns, walked quickly past us and down the street. Her hair was of a lustrous black, and her complexion as pure as milk, but it was not these that for a moment enchanted me, nor the virginal breast half afraid to press the soft gola of her sweater, nor the little waist I might have circled with my two hands. Rather, it was an air, at once insistent and shy, vivacity coupled with an innocence and intelligence that were hers alone. To the woman beside me I said, "What a charming child. Who is she? Her name?" My friend's wife frowned and snapped her fingers. "I can't think of it. But of course you know who she is, don't you? She is the very image of her mother at that age, Suzanne Delage.